For that, my name is Lowry Snow, Representative Snow. I'm chairing the meeting this morning. Our co-chair, Lieutenant Governor, has asked to be excused. She has a speaking engagement that's really important, representing the state of Utah and also representing the women of our state. So we'll excuse her with that. We have members of our board here in person and attending virtually as well. We welcome you both. And we also have some folks here attending live in our meeting, and we welcome you as well. So we'll call the meeting to order. I'm not sure we have a full quorum yet, but we're getting close, but we're going to get started. Just as kind of some background, okay, let's see if that's better. Is that better? Okay. I'm not going to repeat everything I said. It wasn't that great anyway, except the welcoming part. So we welcome members of the board, and we welcome those of you who are in our committee meeting live as well. So as I said, calling the meeting to order, and I did excuse our Lieutenant Governor co-chair. We also welcome our consultants and our staff members. Just as a little bit of way of background, bringing us up to date, due to the legislative session, we didn't hold our regular meeting in February, so we haven't actually had this meeting since January. Since that time, we've made significant progress, and I would underscore significant. Among other things, we've advanced the process to select our phase 1 development partners. We've wrapped up most of the 10 deep dive studies we're conducting to help the board make informed decisions on project enhancement. We've refined our phase 1 plan and associated design guidelines. We've successfully passed legislation authorizing new revenue sources for the land authority. We've made progress on project proposals, refined the project financial framework and pro forma, completed an analysis of the economic and fiscal impacts of the point. We've worked with DFCM to advance early infrastructure work, and much more happening behind the scenes that even as board members we're not aware of. Today we'll discuss a lot of that work, as I said, that's been happening in these activities since we last met. So the second item on our agenda, moving forward with our business, is public comment. Members of the public are given an opportunity to address the board subject to our rules that govern that process. We remind all of us, including board members, that our project, the point, is a public project. As a board, we have a responsibility to ensure that this project provides public benefits. We value input from members of the public. In fact, over 10,000 Utah residents have shared their priorities and ideas and their feedback regarding our guiding and planning thus far. We do welcome public comments, as I said, subject to the procedures outlined on the agenda. Do we have anyone here in the public who would like to speak as part of the public comment? Don't see any hands or anyone coming forward. I think we have some people online. I'm going to ask our director, Alan Matheson, to help me regulate the time. I believe it's 3 minutes. 3 minutes, or if you represent a particular group, 5 minutes. So with that, let's start with David Amat, or Amet, and if I've mispronounced David, you'll forgive me. If you'll turn your mic on, we'll start your time, and we'd like to hear your comment.
Hi, we'll start with that classic question on Zoom. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you. Thanks for
wonderful. All right. Well, thank you for your time. This is David Amet, Executive Director of Preservation Utah. As usual, I am here representing not myself per se, but rather my organization's Board of Trustees and its constituency. The Point Commission staff have asked me to develop a formal proposal treating the future of the Utah State Penitentiary Chapel. I have and I will continue to spend a considerable amount of time developing such a proposal, perhaps even more than one proposal, for the Point of the Mountain Commission to review. My hope, and I would like to say my expectation, is that when these proposals are finished and submitted for consideration, the members of this commission will approach them seriously and not dismiss them at first sight, as I am concerned might happen. I also ask, and to me this is really key, that decisions regarding the chapel's demolition are deferred until these proposals have been reviewed. Everything I've heard stated in Point Commission board meetings regarding preservation of the prison buildings has indicated that this commission is, in large part, set against the preservation of these same buildings. The commission's representatives have suggested in both public meetings and in private conversations with me that it is offensive to even consider saving any of the prison's architecture. So with all of this in mind, I will state again to each member of this commission that I hope that any proposal that is submitted to this commission regarding the chapel receives serious and sincere consideration, and that the chapel's demolition is suspended for the immediate future, even if the idea of preserving any of these prison buildings, including the chapel, is an idea that members of this commission generally find difficult. And why should you take these proposals regarding the prison's chapel seriously? Put simply, the prison's chapel is a story of hope, and the story and the building that embodies the story will greatly enrich the Point of the Mountain development if the chapel is allowed to stand. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, David, for your comments. Let's go to the next person I have down as wanting to speak is Wendy Pettit. Wendy, welcome to our committee. And if you will unmute your mic, you will have the floor.
Thank you. Sorry, I was trying to gather myself. Good morning.
Good morning.
I've been researching and telling stories of Utah's long lost buildings for a few years now. I know firsthand that when we lose a building that's important to our history, we also lose the story of the people and the community associated with that building. I know the prison is viewed as a bad place with an offensive history, but a building's past is no reason for demolition. And it's this stigma that hinders preservation. There is value in buildings with traumatic and questionable pasts. The prison chapel has value. In the 50s, Governor Clyde saw value in the incarcerated people's desire for a chapel. The incarcerated people saw value in themselves to raise money and help build their chapel. The chapel was not only a place of worship, but also a place of redemption, offering opportunities for refuge, healing, and growth. The demolition of this building would negate all the good that it brought to the people who needed it most. Preserving the chapel is not celebrating the prison's history. It's acknowledging its difficult and controversial past while offering a new chapter to a historic building. Just as incarcerated people went to the chapel to find a redemption, preserving this one building can be redemption to the entire prison site. Buildings can and should have more than one chapter. The chapel can start a new chapter as a museum, community gathering space, or event venue while still honoring the past. I beg of you to reconsider your decision to demolish the chapel. You have an opportunity to do right by those who hold this place dear to their hearts, and we owe it to them to continue to tell their story. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Wendy, for your comment. Next is Tamara Walkenhorst. Tamara, if you can hear me, if you'll unmute your mic, we'll receive your comment.
Hello.
Hi, Tamara, we can hear you now.
Oh, okay, great. My name is Tamara Walkenhorst. I'm a Draper resident. My intention this morning is in hopes of saving a part of the state prison at the Point Project. This is a state facility which holds a major part of state history. It was mentioned in a meeting concerning the Point Project, and I quote, that preservation efforts would need to strike an appropriate balance. Keep in mind, it's a prison. Violent and notorious criminals have lived there. End of quote. Our state history consists of a variety of histories, one which focuses a lot on LDS church history. I would think that preserving a small part of the prison would be an appropriate balance for the state. I realize that the old prison is very different from what the Point Project wants to have and project for the future, but we need to remember the past is what brings us to the present and on into the future. In many years from now, the Point will be part of history. Our country is turning away from history. Our history is very important for us and future generations to learn from. If we don't learn from history, it will most likely repeat itself. I would hope that the city of Draper and the state would not follow suit. There is good and unfortunately bad in the world. From having these opposites, it helps us to learn the most for the future, especially in hoping for a better future. I have talked with citizens of Draper and outside of Draper, state residents, about the Point Project. I, along with many others, would like to see a part of the prison preserved, which I would propose be a block of cells, the administration building, the octagon guard tower out front, and the chapel. I would like to see these facilities used as a museum and for educational purposes and as an interactive venue. I can see school field trips, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and families touring the facility. And being a museum, it could help state tourism. Many Draper citizens throughout the years have worked and mostly volunteered at this facility, which should make it a part of Draper's history. Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, known as SOM, are the architect, designers, engineers, and planners for this project. They are known the world over for their expertise, which includes preservation. I would think with their expertise, they could make this a great place to visit. Go in and look at the history of the chapel at the prison. A basketball game was being played between the inmate team and the LDS Granger ward, which turned into a riot. They took the Granger basketball players, refs, and guards as hostages. The purpose was to ask for some things that they would like to see. One of them was a chapel to be built for them, a place of refuge and a place to worship. Some years back, I went to San Francisco and toured. Is my time up?
I don't want to be the one to interrupt you, but if we could get you to wrap up, well, we're a little bit over time.
Okay, that's everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your comments. Apologize for moving on, but we've got several that want to make comments.
That's okay.
Thank you, Tamara. The next person I have is Randall Schumacher. Randall, if you'll unmute, we'll start your time. Hear your comment.
Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Okay. My name is Randy Shoemaker from South Jordan, Utah. I thank the board for allowing the public to comment. I grew up in Draper and had family and friends that either worked at the Utah State Prison or were volunteers. Many people in the surrounding communities did the same. I don't think there is anyone on this commission that would refute the good these people did and discredit the hours they spent in attempting to redeem those inmates who wanted and desired the help of family, friends, and total strangers. Much of that good work took place in the non-denominational chapel and its side rooms located in the Wasatch facility. I am appealing to your foresight and good judgment this morning in helping to save this memorable Wasatch Chapel. The space occupied by this chapel is probably 3/4 of an acre or less. A recent fitting tribute to the Wasatch Chapel took place in its walls on 18 December 2019, when Mac Wilberg, co-conductor of the Tabernacle Choir, and Kirby Hayborn, actor and musician, collaborated on a BYU TV program called Making Good to perform a selection of Christmas music provided by the inmates. This program was digitally recorded and shows the inside of this chapel and some of the side rooms and their purposes. The preservation of the Wasatch Chapel would be a hats off to you board members and a legacy you could be proud of as the years go forward. Many volunteers, former inmates now released, and guests who came to this chapel for programs and church services would gladly enjoy revisiting this chapel once more, bringing their children, grandchildren, friends, and neighbors and showing them this chapel where they spent many hours helping others. The Wasatch Chapel and its location could become a reunion draw for many that helped others there. My wife and I volunteered our time there for 1 year. The commission has the sway and power to not only assure the development of exciting new buildings at the point, but to influence the saving of the Wasatch Chapel at the point, and to enhance its surroundings with appropriate and appealing landscaping. My wife and I would be honored to meet you in the point and at the Wasatch Chapel and show you the legacy you helped leave in preserving this influential building and allowing it once more to bless the lives of men and women who needed its strength when theirs was weak. Please bring your family members and friends on a visit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Randy, for your comments. We still have some people who want to comment. We're going to take those comments. Todd Shoemaker will be the last one. We'll go in this order: Marianne Wright, Dorothy Owen, Craig Kramer, and Todd Shoemaker. And I'm going to ask you, if you can, if your comments are cumulative or essentially what we have heard thus far. I don't want to cut you off, but if you could help us with our time, that would be great. So in that order, I think, Marianne Wright, you were next. We've got, before you get started, we've got other people wanting to comment, but we're going to have to limit the comments to those that I indicated. Thank you. Go ahead, Marianne.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, so some of my things do echo what they have said, but I just would like to also say that I'm going to quote Governor Scott Matheson here, whose famous saying was, some people are just bad. But with that, most people who ended up in the prison have just done bad things. In fact, when I was over the abandoned mine reclamation program, I started that program in the late 70s, and we used a lot of prison labor to help us close up abandoned mines. And they were just people who had done bad things. And so I just wanted to negate that possibility of thought and say that I really think it's important to preserve the chapel. I'm working on preserving a chapel in central Utah. And I just really feel it's important, and I'm asking you to please reconsider that. I visited Alcatraz when I have been in San Francisco, and there is a desire for heritage tourism among many people all over the world. Thank you for the time. I appreciate it.
Marianne, thank you for your comments. Next, Dorothy Owen. If you'll unmute your mic, Dorothy, we'll turn time to you.
My name is Dorothy Owen, and I have been the chair of the West Point Community Council for the past 5 years. And prior to that time, I was the planning and budget analyst in the governor's office for the Department of Corrections. I took this position. West Point is the home of the new Utah State Correctional Facility. And as such, I'm going to take this opportunity to just gently remind everybody that the point, which we're very excited about, is a result of West Point becoming the home of the new Utah State Correctional Facility. At the groundbreaking ceremony I attended of the new correctional facility, Governor Herbert spoke at great length of his vision and the state's vision for the new correctional facility, and asked that it not be referred to as the new prison, that the building, the staffing, the purpose of the facility would be better reflected as the Utah State Correctional Facility. And And at the time, I spoke with him afterwards and said that West Point intended to be a good neighbor to this correctional facility, and that we expected the state to also be a good neighbor and uphold their promises that they had made in putting this facility in our neighborhood. The chapel at the Point is really, for us, a symbol of whether of the long road we have gone in correctional philosophy. And it didn't start just with building building this new billion-dollar facility, but started many, many years ago, and looking at an institution as a means for improving people's lives and correcting their mistakes and redemption. I asked that the board maintain the chapel. It's a symbol to us that this approach doesn't start with just the new correctional facility, but is a continuation of what the state has wanted to do many, many years ago when it started and built this chapel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Dorothy, thanks for your comments. Next is Cindy. I don't see Cindy anymore. Let's go to the last comment, Todd Shoemaker. Oh, Cindy, I'm sorry, Cindy Kramer is down below. Let's, Cindy, didn't mean to bypass you. Let's take your comment. Go ahead, Cindy, if you unmute your mic. Cindy, you'll need to unmute your mic.
Thanks. Thanks. I think I got it now, the technology. My name is Cindy Cromer. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Yes, it looks like my words are showing up on the screen. I spoke to you at the last meeting in January about the experiences I've had over the past 40 years at the prison. I may be unique in that all of my experiences have been positive, ranging from educational programs to job skills training, and each time I was one of the beneficiaries. I said in January that I do not expect other people to have had the positive experiences that I have. I benefited from the programs at the prison because of my own needs and interests. I consider myself fortunate. People who only know about the negative aspects of the prison are less fortunate than I have been. Your responsibilities include redevelopment of the site. They also encompass being honorable about the site in its redevelopment. I think, for example, that you have succeeded with the Range to River corridor. It contributes to the redevelopment of the site, and at the same time, it honors or respects its topography. So what could you do to convey the complexities of the prison story? I couldn't be the author because all of my own experiences are positive. You have decided to tell the story by retaining symbols of surveillance and control, the watchtower and the locking mechanism. Those remnants alone are not fair to the employees whose careers flourished here, to the residents who acquired new skills, to the community which supported the residents and the employees, or to individuals who completed their sentences and never encountered law enforcement again. And I am very pleased to hear from some of those people today, this morning. Again, the story of the prison is complex, and you have chosen to focus on the negative aspects, which are, without question, part of the story. It's clear to me that you have an opportunity to decide what represents the most recent chapter in the history of this place called Point of the Mountain. It also seems that you're willing to absorb the cost of retaining the watchtower and the lock, but that the community will have to pay for the chapel again if we want a symbol of the accomplishments associated with the prison. The community already donated the funds for the chapel once before, and the residents at the prison donated the labor. It seems the message is, if you want the positive side of the story, if you want the story of possible redemptions, then you, the community, need to pay for it again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cindy, for your comments. And the last comment on the preservation of the chapel will be by Todd Shoemaker.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
My name is Todd Shoemaker from Draper, Utah. I have a master's degree in history from the University of Utah and taught for 30 years in the Jordan School District. I was on the Draper Historic Preservation Commission for almost 15 years, but resigned over Draper City Mayor Troy Walker's lack of support for prison preservation. This attitude was later made apparent at a Point board meeting of which he is a member, where he made repeated adamant declarations that not even one historic prison building should be left standing, even after this institution has served our state and city superbly for over 70 years. How did this drastic idea creep into the minds of board members that every building at the prison had to be demolished? I want to remind the Point board of past comments made by you and illustrations presented to the public that gave the preservation community and the public the impression that some prison buildings would be saved and utilized and not demolished. First, I organized 2 prison tours while serving on the Draper Preservation Commission. I invited Ari Bruning and others of Envision Utah to attend. And at the end of the tour, Envision Utah recommended to, quote, preserve a portion of the existing prison to provide historic context and authenticity, preserve the A block prison cells and a guard tower, and explore repurposing one or more buildings for incubator, research classroom, or other space, end of quote. Clearly, no mention was made here of eliminating all the prison structures. Secondly, on September 18th, 2019, I invited Alan Matheson, recently appointed executive director of the Point, to attend our Draper Preservation meeting. For over an hour, discussion took place of all the possible uses that could be made of reusing prison buildings, focusing on those structures in the Wasatch facility. There was never any talk of demolishing all the prison buildings. Third, at a Point Open House 2 meeting on May 5th, 2021, Mr. Matheson stated that there were ways to use some of the existing facilities at the prison to perhaps incorporate in some of these historic buildings some job training, workforce training, and so on. Notice again, we are keeping buildings, not destroying them. Fourth, at a Point Open House in Draper in August 2021, the public was invited to look at illustrated schematics and drawings displayed by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. Almost every map of the site showed symbols for the prison buildings at the Wasatch facility and sentences saying, quote, innovative accelerator and academy with repurposed historic prison buildings. Peter Kendall of SOM repeated the same phrase in his presentations. Fifth, at the Point board meeting of September 14th, 2021, Mr. Matheson mentioned 4 buildings that were most important to save: an old wooden building used to house prisoners helping to construct the prison, Cell Block D, Old Cell Block East, and the old administration building. Point board, please get back on track and remove this unwise idea of destroying all prison buildings. We don't need a repeat of the Sugar House prison history, and above all, save the prison chapel. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd, for your comments. That will conclude our comments on from parties interested in preservation issues. Is there anyone else online that would like to make a comment other than about preservation? I think I've taken all the names that currently have their hand up, except Elizabeth Gerard. Elizabeth, if you have a comment other than on a preservation issue, you're free to speak. But if it's on the same issue, we need to move on with the agenda. I don't hear
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Elizabeth.
Okay, thank you. And that I was going to speak to implore you to save the chapel, but you have, I understand that you have the sentiment of the people who have spoken, so I won't take up more of your time. Thank you.
Well, Elizabeth, we're nevertheless grateful that you're here and that we know what your position is. So with that, we'll close public comment, that part of our agenda. And again, we appreciate very much the comments that have been given. And I believe the board has heard those and will take those into consideration. So the next matter on the agenda, now that we have a quorum, and I'll declare we do have a quorum, is to take up some business as item number 3. I would consider approving or entertaining a motion to approve our minutes of January 11th, 2022.
Representative Snow, this is Dave, so moved.
Okay. We've got Jim Russell making, I think he got to it first, David, but you'll second it. Is that correct?
Yes.
All in favor of that motion, say aye. Any opposed, say nay.
Aye.
The motion carries and the minutes are approved. Thank you for your help. So the next matter on the agenda, number 4, is Scott Cuthbertson. You will all recall that at our direction, we engaged national experts to conduct detailed analysis of proposed project enhancements at the point. The purpose of these studies was to identify the range of strategies available to us and how those strategies have performed elsewhere. What benefits we could expect from these strategies if we were to incorporate them at the point, what investment would be required to achieve these potential benefits, and what are the potential sources of funding. Staff members have met weekly with the research teams to focus their analysis. This information that you're about to hear today will help us make good decisions, balancing the costs and benefits of various approaches. We're going to focus today on 3 areas of study that have been undertaken: smart mobility, sustainability, and smart technology. So Scott, who is our Director of Operations, will turn the time to you for your presentation. Thank you, Scott. Excuse me, Scott. For me, I'm some distance from this mic here and sometimes don't get as close, but we need to have you pull up your mic too, if we could. Maybe a little bit closer. Oh, I'll tell you what the problem is. The chair needs to turn on your mic. So why don't you try that now? Let's get you a little more volume there. Try it now. Does it sound like the mic? Try that other mic. Try that one there. Somehow our tech support needs to help us with those mics.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Okay, excellent.
I forgot to tell you, there's a little light for you to turn it on too. So
No problem. Okay, so, there's been a lot of excellent work that's gone into these studies with our partners, AECOM, Sam Schwartz, also Steve Kellenberg and Aaron Talkington. Want to thank them. It's been months in the making, and we're excited to take steps forward to making the aspirations of this project a reality. Given limited time, it's difficult to present what will be encompassed in 300 pages of technical reports forthcoming this week. But we would like to show kind of progress made, talk about the strategies that we feel best meet the framework plan goals, and then show some of the analysis we've done on how these will be paid for, which is of course an important critical consideration. It's also important to note that there is another critical dependency before we finalize a program of enhancements, and that is to collaborate with our potential master development partners to get their feedback on their ideas around how to implement these strategies and to look at ways to fund them as well. So what we'd like to do today is ask for your feedback on whether we're on the right track with these initial proposed solutions, and then to request additional support and continuing that analysis, in particular on the financing piece, as we're working with Zions Bank to help sort through that side of it. Okay. So we'll start with the framework plan goals, which, as you know, were the result of a lengthy public process, and we identified These key vision elements, as well as more detailed targets for sustainability, smart city aspirations, and those were then rolled into our framework plan goals. And so as we looked at these framework plan goals, we were able to identify strategies that help us to achieve most of these goals, in some cases exceed them. In other cases, we needed to pivot a little bit given challenges and site constraints. But across all of them, we're able to largely meet the spirit of the goals, if not the letter of the goal. As we look at net zero carbon, for instance, we have a target of 50% reduction operational carbon. And we believe we can go further than that and achieve a zero carbon or near zero carbon community, given the conditions around the site, namely that Rocky Mountain Power is decarbonizing their grid, which we will be direct beneficiaries from. Also, we looked at reducing embodied carbon in the built environment by 20%. We realized that would be cost prohibitive. So just an example of how we're able to go further in some cases, but in other cases, we may need to scale back a little bit. As we look at energy.
Excuse me, Scott, before we move on, just for those of us that are not real familiar with the term embodied carbon, maybe I'm the only one, but educate us.
So that's basically kind of the supply chain. If you think about where building materials come from and how those are produced, there's a lot of carbon that's used in making those products. And there are ways to purchase products and building supplies that are less carbon intense. And so that's what is meant by embodied carbon.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. As we looked at energy, we have the goal of reducing energy from the grid by 50%. And we're able to achieve that goal through a number of measures, including smart lighting fixtures and energy systems, efficient building envelopes, et cetera. Also, we believe we can maximize electric power on the site, which will help us to achieve that zero carbon community, as well to have 50% renewables used on the site. So that's primarily through solar, but also through the geothermal source on the site, which we believe can be used to provide that renewable energy source. And also will save residents at the point money. And that idea of maximizing electrification, that's a target that a number of cities globally have to achieve that by 2050. And that's our target as well, is to achieve that zero carbon community, and by having an intense electrification component on the site. As we looked at water, we know there's never been a more important focus on water than right now in the state of Utah. And we want this site to be a model for how we use water in as smart and as efficient way as possible. And so our goal there is to reduce potable water use by 40%. We want to reuse more than 15% of the water. And then we have the ambitious goal of using 100% non-potable water for irrigation. So think of that as drinking water, but using secondary water for irrigation across the site. As we look at waste, we want to achieve 50% waste diversion. That's through means such as reuse, reducing waste, and recycling. And also to divert construction waste significantly in that construction process. We didn't have a firm defined goal for smart technologies in the framework plan. It was more sort of a general goal to be a smart, innovative community. We define that using standards from what's known as the INSPIRE program. It's an industry association that sets forth the smart technology goals and ideas. And we believe we can have 50% of what would be considered a full smart community. And we'll talk about each of the strategies for these goals in this presentation. For vehicle miles traveled reduction, using automobiles less on the site, we had the initial goal of achieving 33% less VMT on the site. Looking at that closely, we realized that wouldn't be feasible, but we can achieve a 25% reduction. And to put that into context, the University of Utah students have about a 30% VMT reduction target. So that's students who have access to public transportation are more likely to use it. Salt Lake City residents have a 6% rate of those who use transit for work. So a 25% target is very ambitious, but certainly achievable and critical to reducing congestion and traffic on the site, but also to creating the type of activated pedestrian type of community that we're looking for. So I'll talk a little about the methodology that we used. This is a sort of a complicated slide, but really to simplify it, we looked at the different systems that would be needed on the site to help deliver these strategies, meet these targets around energy and carbon, water, transportation, environment, and waste. And we analyzed a number of scenarios as well as the costs, the benefits, the trade-offs and constraints. And then looking across all of these programs, we're able to find optimal strategies to help us meet these targets in a way that would be financially viable and deliver on the benefits. We've come up with three really selected scenarios by looking across, the baseline for the project, what's required in the framework plan, and then going above and beyond, looking at these strategies from a good, better, and best scenario. And what we have is a goal optimized scenario, a cost optimized scenario, and then an innovation scenario. And so the goal optimized scenario, that really attempts to maximize the number of goals achieved while keeping it within a certain cost threshold, which we'll talk about how that's allocated to various stakeholders. But we wanted that to be less than 2% of the cost to developers on the project. And this also has a simpler governance structure and has, but it has a lower ROI, but also lower investment. So it's a little more sort of feasible out of the gate. The cost optimized scenario, this scenario meets and exceeds most of the goals and has a lower cost premium, so 1.5%. And then it does require more investment, which will likely come out of the land value. So there's a trade-off there, getting more benefits, but also getting a little less upfront from the land value if we were to choose this scenario. It has a strong ROI as well. The innovative scenario also meets or exceeds most of the goals and has the most benefits, but requires more investment. And it also requires some innovative financing approaches. And we'll get into that more. But the idea of a utility association, which would be something the state would participate in as a stakeholder, as well as developers, building owners and occupants on the site to help cover the cost of some of these strategies. Now, there's more analysis needed on it. It's an idea that we've seen in other projects, but in each case it's unique to the situation of the project. So we like the idea of it because it would allow us to maximize the benefits, reduce the upfront cost, but needs further analysis. So back to the question of who pays for it. We looked at the CapEx cost and considered how much would be required of the state, how much of the horizontal developer, the vertical developer, this utility association, and then private owners in the site, as well as third parties such as energy service company or NESCO that could come in and enter into a public-private partnership, front some of the capital in particular for district energy solutions, so a geothermal solution or a community solar solution. And then we looked at what's the incremental cost to deploy these strategies above and beyond the baseline. And so you'll see that in the slides further in the presentation. We did the same analysis on the operating expense side. So both the upfront and then what's the ongoing cost to service these strategies. I'd like to go into more detail on smart mobility work stream, and then we'll go into the sustainability and smart technology work streams. So you've heard of these before, but just to give a quick overview, the ideas, the strategies that we're looking at for smart mobility are a circulator, which is an internal transit service around the site, helps with that first and last mile connection within and outside the community. A fleet of bikes and e-bikes and scooters, which is what micromobility represents. Car sharing, so you've probably heard of Zipcar. It's an option that allows people on the site to have that one car community or even be a zero car community to quickly take a car and off site and then use it for half a day or a day. Mobility hubs. This is an idea that kind of brings together various mobility options in one specific location. And then mobility as a service, which is a platform that really ties all of this together, all these solutions together, and allows people to pay for services in a centralized app, but also to look at what's the most optimal route to get me from A to B, what's the cost of it, and have that at the in the palm of their hands, essentially. So looking at the circulator, you'll see on the slide here, this would be the route for that circulator. It's about 2.3 miles. We'd have service every 5 to 10 minutes. There would be, it would be serviced in 2 directions. And this really contributes to that, sort of park once mentality, the 15-minute community, and helps with that first and last mile, those first and last mile connections. Smart mobility. This is, again, the bikes, the e-bikes, the e-scooters, but also having the infrastructure in place to really make that safe and optimal. So we have, designed a world-class pathway program that distinguishes between bike and scooter lanes versus walking lanes. And we would propose for these solutions to have 2 to 3 vendors on the site to encourage competition and get ideal pricing for those vehicles. So we go to smart mobility, you'll see the layout here where you'd have a certain number of vehicles in various districts throughout the site. And those allocations would be based on other projects and best practices. And the smart mobility hubs. So there are various types of hubs. There would be a micro hub, which you don't see on this map, but that would be basically one mode in a single location. Maybe next to a circulator stop, you would have, your e-bikes, for instance. There would be several district hubs, which would take place in curb space, and that would combine mobility uses. So you'd have scooters, the circulator stop, and perhaps, your e-bikes in one place. And then a regional hub, there would be a couple of these where we would have the BRT stop, and you would also have those micro mobility solutions, and you, in addition, would have could kind of incorporate this into the development. So it could be part of a retail store. You might have a cafe there. You could have FedEx shipping options, Amazon lockers, et cetera. So we go to the mobility as a service app. Again, this is that one-stop kind of location to see how you would optimize your travel for the day and pay for it. And a key component of this would be subsidies by the companies that are on the site. We would also look to partner with UTA to provide transit subsidy as is currently part of their program at the University of Utah. And really helping to adopt these micromobility and other transportation strategies. So what we did in our evaluation process for smart mobility was looked at the good, better, best scenarios for each of these strategies, and then what were the cost implications, how much impact could we achieve, what's the benefit to cost ratio, and really we came up with 3 strategies that we want to explore and present to you. And those strategies are found on this next slide. We have the first option, which is basically just what's in the framework plan. So you'd have minimum ridership, you'd have some of the infrastructure in place, but you wouldn't really move the needle to reduce congestion or traffic to the degree that we envision on the site. The next 3 that you see here were options that help us to achieve to varying degrees more benefits around reduction of parking space, increase the land value, household savings for individuals who use mobility, smart mobility versus having a car. There are also health benefits associated with walking. There's empirical data we referenced on how to quantify those benefits, reduce congestion, as well as sustainability benefits from reduced emissions. And we're recommending the better scenario. We think that's an option that has strong ROI for the land authority. It's also, we think, palatable financially for development partners. And it allows us to scale up in the future as well if we want to go further into these these opportunities. And so this is what would be included in the better scenario. I won't go into all the details on this, but sufficient to say it's a robust option around each of those strategies that we think really helps to make this an example of a smart, really an example regionally of smart growth, and how do we improve traffic challenges and congestion, as well as making it a really dynamic, walkable community. And what do the costs look like? Well, we've broken those down here. So in the baseline column, that's what's envisioned currently in the framework plan. The incremental costs will be on top of that to bring in these strategies. So there would be about $20 million in capital costs above the baseline upfront cost, but then you look at the benefits, and the total economic benefit is significant. And it's 2-to-1 essentially ratio there. And these costs basically cover vehicles and stations for the circulator, trails, intersection, crossing enhancements for the active transportation element, EV vehicle subsidies, and the structure for the mobility hub, structure and amenities around that. So we look on the OpEx side of it, we're looking at about $7 million annually in ongoing operating expenses, but compare that to $26.8 million in benefits also annually that would be captured. And who bears those costs? We've broken that down here. There would be a community association component to this where users would pay for part of it. Again, the corporations at the site for their employees would be asked to subsidize some of this. The vertical and horizontal developers as well would need to contribute. The land authority, there's a nominal cost around this, but the benefits are substantial. And if we just look at those at a high level, we're seeing 2.2 million fewer trips in cars per year, $52 million from less parking that would be required on the site, $3 million annually from reduced congestion, and then $8 million in annual health savings from cleaner air and more physical activity on the site and those coming into it, and about $16 million from residents at the point who won't have to pay the same as they would if they were driving their vehicle, but prefer rather to use the transit options here. So before we move on to sustainability and smart city, I want to see if there are any questions from the board at this point.
Board members, questions? Let's go to Mike Maurer. Did I get your mic there? Yeah, it is.
Is working now. Okay. Representing Lieutenant Governor Henderson, quick question. I see neighborhoods in Salt Lake where they have, and what impacts a family member of mine, where they said, we're close to transit, people aren't going to drive. And so they didn't build enough parking. And so it spills out into the neighborhood surrounding that area. How do we prevent something like that from taking place here? On a cold, snowy winter day, no one wants to ride a scooter or borrow a bike. They want to get in their car and go get their groceries and come home. How do we at this spot make sure that we don't have that spillage effect where they only build enough parking because they think people are going to take transit, but instead, a couple gets married and they both keep their cars?
That's a great question. And we've talked through that extensively. We've discussed it with our potential development partners as well. And really what needs to take place is there will be a lot of density on the site that'll help to mitigate this a little bit. We're also planning to have kind of a phasing of parking available on the site. So in the first phase, we would be looking at kind of co-parking. We would be looking at some structured parking potentially. And then we'll see how the technology progresses. We'll see kind of how adoption is taking place in other projects, and be able to kind of follow that pattern as we kind of roll out these solutions. So we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but we're planning for being able to really maximize those solutions.
Thank you.
Scott, if I could just add to that, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Steve. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say that it's a fantastic question, and it's kind of a dynamic situation on this because we're really kind of a little bit on the cutting edge of applying all these strategies simultaneously. But one of the things that will check an over exuberance of our anticipation of the impact of these is actually going to be these the developers, the phase one developer, because as we're kind of talking to the various candidates, Scott mentioned this, they're already, they're going to be representing the market, and they're going to have to get financing on their projects, and they're going to have to provide sufficient parking for their tenants. And so we're hearing from them kind of loud and clear that they think this is something we need to grow into, and that we'll start with some more modest assumptions on market penetration of these systems, and then as Scott said, just really see how they affect, and we can measure their effect on parking demand, and be more aggressive as they prove themselves out.
Thanks, Steve. Other questions from board members? So I've got a question, but maybe I should wait until after your next one is Smart City, right?
Correct.
And maybe I'll wait till after that presentation.
Thank you for those comments. So we'll talk about sustainability and smart city technology. So you've seen some of these solutions in the previous board meeting. We walked through a lot of the ideas that we were contemplating, and we've moved those forward. And we have this, again, a good, better, best approach. This slide shows what water strategies we considered. So you can see there's water efficient fixtures. We're looking at water efficient landscaping options. We would look at improving that as you kind of go through each scenario. So under the better scenario, we're proposing secondary water for irrigation, as we mentioned, at least partially, rooftop rainwater with barrels. So that helps with the reuse of water. As you go further into it, we would be kind of expanding expanding the amount of secondary water irrigation on the site. And then finally, we would look at potentially bringing in secondary water for toilet flushing in the buildings, which would really help us to optimize our water strategy and to use less potable water, which again was a key target for the project. So what you'll see in the circled column is what we're proposing in our innovative scenario. And so you'll see that on each of these subsequent slides. And so for building energy, we would be proposing a district heating and cooling solution. So this is that geothermal source that would be used kind of across a number of buildings and districts. So it really helps to reduce the sort of fixed cost that you would see in providing this type of solution on a building by building level. And we would look to bring in an energy services company, an ESCO, to front that upfront capital, and then to operate that, and they would receive return to cover their upfront investment. But it would reduce the amount that we have to come up with as a state, and also our development partners. So it makes it more financially viable. We would increase the electrification component as you go through each of these scenarios. So looking at heating and service hot water, we would improve the building envelope to make it more energy efficient in each of these good, better, best scenarios as well. And then using more solar in those strategies also. Okay, for waste, we're looking at a variety of strategies: waste management education program, an exchange and donation program for obsolete items found around the house or by businesses, and enhanced recycling, so a 3-bin waste collection system. And then as you go up the chain here, recommending a pay-as-you-throw program, which basically kind of moves from charging for waste based on the a flat fee to the amount that's generated based on volume or based on weight. So we go into the smart city recommendations. We touched on a number of these in the last board meeting that we had, but I'll give a quick recap of the ones that we've already talked about, and then go a little further into the ones that we haven't. but we've basically bucketed this into 6 categories. You have smart ICT infrastructure. That's basically the information communication technology infrastructure that's needed for the site. And then you have smart environments, sort of self-explanatory. That's the sort of the ecosystem ideas. And then you have smart utilities, a smart community, which is more about public space, public realm, access to information, and then smart mobility, which we talked about, and smart buildings. So under the ICT infrastructure, we're proposing that there's an investment in the interduct system upfront. So making sure we have ample conduit in the ground to allow for a number of vendors to come in and run their own fiber. So we have that balance of trade, that competition on the site, but then also having the option for a private network to serve the state in deploying a number of those smart technology solutions, which will be very cost effective to us. We won't be dependent on leasing fiber from a third party. We won't be beholden to them for expensive change orders. And it has a quick payback period if we do that. The fiber optic cable infrastructure, that's the fiber that would be run. And then the Wi-Fi infrastructure and the passive optical network, very technical things, but they're essential to be able to realize that smart vision strategy. You have to have the infrastructure in place. And then we would look at fiber meet me rooms. These are really facilities on the site that would help improve the performance, decrease latency for computers, for internet, and that's attractive to the type of technology companies that we want to bring to this project. As we look at smart environment, we're proposing air quality sensors, sound level monitoring, smart lighting systems, and more to be a very environmentally focused type of community. Smart utilities, looking at centralized energy monitoring, a community microgrid of solar that allows us to optimize the solar power on the site, which can't be done on a really building by building or parcel by parcel basis. There's a cap that's put in place around how much solar can be used by each parcel. But if we have a community solution, we're able to sort of transfer the costs, transfer the amount of power that's used across buildings and across districts. Makes for a much more energy sufficient, efficient solution. Dynamic HPC, this is a technology that helps with that microgrid option. And then smart community considerations. There's ability to monitor wastewater, to have early indicators of health issues on the site. Data, of course, would be anonymized and secured, but it's a program that has been put in place nationally by EPA and in partnership with CDC. We would have smart kiosks on the site. So in the public realm, you'd be able to go to a kiosk and find information about the stores that are around you and information about the site in general. Smart refuse, so really monitoring the amount of waste in dumpsters and making that pickup and collection cycle more efficient. A smart community app, this is basically what we walk through with smart mobility in terms of that kind of one-stop shop for understanding and paying for your mobility services, but we'd also have more features included about the site in general. And then open data. Utah is renowned for its open data policies, and we would look to have a similar policy at the point, providing information for the businesses that are located there to be able to do research. Having a community smart wall, this would be really kind of integrated with public art. You'd have murals, and you could tag, geotag information to those locations. You would have augmented reality and virtual reality features to really make an interactive experience with the art in the public space. I won't repeat the smart mobility solutions that we talked about, but there are a couple in addition to those: smart parking, smart and connected intersections, being able to really manage and monitor traffic on the site in real time. And then, of course, EV adoption, significant deployment of EV charging stations. And then I'll go into smart buildings in a moment, but want to, again, pause. There's a lot of information here and see if there are any questions to this point.
I don't see any lights and
Yeah, Larry, I had my hand up. This is Steve.
Okay, Steve, I'm sorry. I didn't have your,
Okay.
okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Scott. This is amazing. You're giving us a vision of the city of the future built the way that we would like it to be built, and it's just amazing. I'm the one that had that brief exposure several years, now a few years ago, to Columbus, Ohio, to the U.S. Department of Transportation's smart city demonstration city. I think it was $60 million they gave them or something. So I had a brief exposure there, but certainly had a great vision. But what you're doing here is really amazing to me. I had two questions. You mentioned the geothermal source, geothermal. Have we fully investigated this asset that's on the source to determine, can it be expanded, and how will it be, I guess, how will it be used? You referenced it a little bit. Second question is, I think you answered this because you were talking about solar, and I had a question about community solar, and then you did segue into the necessity for community solar in terms of a competitive system. So just really a lot of praise for the vision that you're articulating here. Lots of planning and amazing, really great thoughts. But just quickly respond to a couple of those thoughts that I had, Scott. Thanks.
Certainly. Thank you for the question, Representative. And we looked at Columbus and other cities as sort of analogs for the project and borrowed from some of their ideas. On the point for geothermal, that district energy solution, there's been some preliminary analysis. We've seen some reports from prior studies about the viability of that as an option here. And we believe that it is. That we haven't fully proven that out yet, but we believe that it's viable based on what we've seen so far. That would essentially, that allows us to use a renewable energy source and to provide cheaper power for businesses and for residents across the site. And that would be kind of done through a loop system, and it wouldn't necessarily reach to all the residential homes on the kind of the west side of the site, but it would encompass everything around that sort of core area and the businesses within most of the districts, and provide for that cheaper energy source. In terms of community solar, that's something that we really are pushing for, depending on the scenario that we take. Again, going back to the cost benefit trade-offs, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the upcoming slides. But we would like to have that, but there are some dependencies around it.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Scott. We can talk about this offline a little more. It's great. But on the geothermal, I hope that you have connected with, I had tried this earlier with Alan. I don't know what happened with the Energy and Geoscience Institute at the University of Utah. These guys are, of course, doing the Forge project, and they know they are the experts in geothermal. So there you go.
Good. Thank you.
So Scott, do you have another section left?
We have one more section. For time constraint, we can speed through that.
But that's okay. Why don't you go through that, and then I've got some questions kind of on a larger scale type that like to have you and Steve weigh in on.
Okay, sounds great. So I won't go into detail. This is a really granular slide, but I think suffice to say, we're looking at smart buildings on the site and a number of sort of unique features to those buildings. This slide kind of shows how we brought it all together and how we, took what's recommended in smart mobility with what's recommended in sustainability and the smart city technology, and kind of looked at what the cost implications are and what's the most optimal program. So you'll see that we're selecting good, better, and best in a variety of the systems that are recommended. I just would mention briefly that one of the benefits from this analysis has been we now have a dynamic model that we can update really instantaneously. So if we decide to go a different direction with any of these solutions, we can model it out in really in quick order and see what the implications are. And that'll become important as we get into further discussions with our development partner. So looking at the program scenarios, this is the goal optimized approach. And what this is basically a scenario that maximizes the number of goals that we achieve. We're able to achieve most of them, with the exception of the embodied carbon, which, as we said, is cost prohibitive. We come close on the carbon zero target. We're at 90% rather than 100%. And this brings with it a simpler governance structure. If we look at how the costs break down, total incremental cost above the baseline is 129 million. And you'll see how that is allocated to the land authority and to the development community. Again, keeping this for our development partners lower than 2% of their cost. And in future scenarios, we can bring that down even further, we believe. And then again, how this in more detail is broken down by specific solution. That $130 million capital investment, a significant portion of that would come through the saved costs from not having to build as much parking. That's a big assumption. We've explored that idea initially with in our conversation with developers. There seems to be an opportunity for it, but we do need to explore that further. That really would help offset the costs for renewables that are being proposed. And you'll see that this really trickles down. So there's a nominal cost to the businesses and the residents on the site. A resident would pay essentially $126 more a year to save $571 in their energy bills. So that's how the math works out. If we go to the cost optimized strategy, this is a scenario that keeps us below that 2%, actually at a 1.5% cost premium to the development community, which is, we believe, palatable, and in our pro forma model could be absorbed there. It also saves them and residents and tenants money for having more, energy efficient solutions. And we see how that breaks down here. You'll see that there are costs recoverable through the savings. In this instance, there would be requirement to bring some of the cost out of the land value. So the state would essentially need to subsidize some of this in order for that infrastructure to be put in up front. The following strategy, we wouldn't require that subsidy, but in this scenario, we wanted to have one that we thought kind of maximized the benefits and we could deploy today. It would require some investment, but there's not as much uncertainty around, this innovative financing strategy of a utility association that we're exploring. So this one could be deployed, but at some cost to the state. And again, you see how that breaks down and you see the net savings. The final strategy is this innovative approach, and this achieves all the targets minus the embodied carbon. We would have that net zero carbon community, and the benefits are greater across the board. So is the investment. So this would be 337 million that's required. And you'll see how that breaks down by entity. Again, we're able to keep actually much lower for the vertical developer, residential, non-residential, making it more viable for them to buy into it. But it would require a utility association. So I guess in comparison, to wrap up here, we can see what these look like side by side. And you'll see that AECOM has recommended the innovative strategy. And what we'd ask is that approval to proceed to kind of explore more the possibility of deploying that utility association, which would give us more benefit, but would require more involvement from the state. Or we could proceed with the cost optimized strategy and discuss that further with our development partners, or the goal optimized approach, which you have less benefits, but is also easier to deploy kind of on day one. So we'll pause there and take any other questions and go from that point.
Thank you, Scott. There's a lot of material here, and as I think you mentioned in your opening remarks, you boiled this down what was otherwise 300 pages. Is that what you said?
That's correct.
So it's highly technical, but I also think that it speaks to the intensity level of your team that you're a part of with Steve in looking at all of this. My first question is really easy, but on the smart or the smart mobility and the parking, will we get to the point where I'll have an app on my phone that tells me how to get to the open parking place?
Yes, sir, you will.
Is that the goal?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, the other one is for you and for Steve. we talk about this being cutting edge, but we're not necessarily moving into experimental, I hope. And so my question is, are we seeing projects that incorporate these scenarios or one of these scenarios into a workable and a marketable project in other places of the country? Do you understand my question?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll take a stab at it and then Steve can weigh in as well. But I think that there's not a single solution in what we've recommended that hasn't been done or isn't being done on other projects. What makes it unique is that they're all leading edge and they're all looking at what is being done and incorporating them here. If you take them all together, if we were to try to achieve 100% on each of the goals that we're proposing, that would be too much. There would be too much to invest and there would be risk of not achieving it. We think in these scenarios, we're likely to achieve all of them. If we could achieve 75 to 50%, we would be in good shape. But we do think that these are manageable. We do need to analyze them more. We need to talk with our development partners, get their perspective, and that could moderate things a bit.
Thank you.
I think Scott's kind of summed it up. I think if the thing that it makes this probably potentially unique in the country would be to take all of these strategies and actually succeed in all of them on a single project. Whereas, as Scott said, all of these strategies have been implemented individually on various projects, but it's fairly rare that all of them occur in one. And I would say the thing that's I think interesting to me in terms of experimental, like what is really experimental here, I think kind of the hardware part of it, the various mobility solutions and the various sustainability solutions have clearly been done other places. The thing that's a little bit on the most cutting edge is this notion of a utility association that would be a nonprofit sort of corporate entity that would manage all of the solar and a lot of the energy components. And the assumption that we can pull that off is somewhat aggressive, but the savings, the economics of that, if we can, help subsidize a number of these other programs and make them more affordable. And the other thing I'm not going to say aggressive, but because it's being done all over the country or in a number of places, is having a third party come in. The ESCO, if you know, Scott has mentioned that several times, but you may not know what that is. The ESCOs are where a third party financial entity comes in and basically pays for all, big chunks of the energy, system, the solar, potentially the district energy system. And then they manage that, and then they amortize the cost of that through the efficiencies and savings of those systems. And so the utility association and the ESCOs are the two mechanisms that make a lot of these very progressive systems possible. And so, there's some work that needs to be done to do, proof of concept on those. Because if we decide that they're, beyond our grasp, it probably would push us down the ladder a little bit on some of these the sort of aggressiveness of some of these systems.
Thanks, Steve. And April's got a question before I go to her, though. I'd like you to weigh in on this thought that no matter how cutting edge and don't take this wrong, anyone, how much we're in love with this technology and these concepts, it has to be a marketable project. It has to be one that a developer looks at and says, notwithstanding these standards and all of these innovations, I've got to be able to have a return on my investment. I also have to be able to convince a tenant that the lease that they're going to be paying that essentially incorporates what I've had to invest if I'm the developer, is worth the price. And so, do you feel like we're still headed in a direction that our investors, our developers would be interested in, and it's going to be marketable to them and in turn marketable to a tenant? Do you understand my question?
I do, yeah. And that's a great question. And we've put that at the forefront of our mind as we're going through this analysis. We know that has to be able to be borne by the developers, by the state as well. And so that's why we kind of set that cost premium threshold of 2%. We think if we can get down to 1.5%, that's palatable. We model that in our pro forma. In some cases, it gets a little above that. So that is something that's going to be key in discussing with our development partners, making sure it works for them. We think we have a number of scenarios and financial sort of approaches that help get us there. But if we have to back off some trade off and, with some of the strategies to make it more viable for them, we're open to doing that. Thank you.
Well, I would add, again, the thing that makes it palatable to the developers is these creative financing, strategies. So we need, again, to make sure those are real and work. But the first thing the developer is going to say to us on some of these things is, yeah, we're happy to do anything you want us to do. But and we have to be able to make a certain hurdle rate on our investment. And they all are going to have, hurdle rates that if they can't make those, they're going to say, never mind. And so in order to do that, and if there are additional costs, they're just going to say, well, we can just pay less for the land. And so at the end of the day, it's really going to be, the board's decision as to how much you want to sort of balance, some impact on revenue from the land to achieve, some of these systems.
Thanks, Steve. The important point. April has a question. April?
Okay, so my question is on some of this creative financing. On the screen that you have it on right now, in the middle portion where it shows total incremental cost, and you jump from 129 million on goal optimized to 337 million for AECOM recommended. The bulk of that is down in a line called District Association, basically $170 million. And then under other, there's $86 million. If these are upfront costs, and you mentioned somewhere in there that this district association might be a nonprofit, where's the money really coming from? I don't understand how 170 million is going to be thrown in there by a nonprofit organization. And typically in an association, like an HOA or a condo or a building association, will collect fees from the tenants over time and build up a residual or an account to be able to do things. If this is upfront, could someone please explain to me who's paying that 170 million into the district association and where the 86 million of others coming from? I just want to understand it a little bit better.
That's a great question. And so the utility association or district association would have to raise that money up front. So that's where the state would have to be a stakeholder in it. It would be a public-private partnership arrangement. You'd also have the developer entities who would have to be involved in that, raise some capital. And that would be paid back through cost savings over time. The 89 million or the 85 million rather, that's largely from the ESCO, so that energy services company, third party, would bring their own capital in, investing in that geothermal solution and the community solar solution. And then they would operate and be paid back for that. It is a sort of a novel idea. We've seen some similar structures in other projects in terms of this district utility. But there are questions around legality, questions around financial feasibility that we have to sort through. But if we can do that, it allows us to really raise the level of the strategies and the benefits that we put in the project. But still more analysis is certainly needed.
Okay.
So I would,
that 170 million, the district association could certainly, then the components of it could come from developers having to contribute, the state having to contribute. So those line items right above may end up being larger. We're just showing it in a different category.
That's right.
Okay, thanks.
But the big idea here is not that. if we thought it was being paid for by the developers, it would show up in the developer line item. The idea is it's a little misleading calling it a district association, and we've kind of struggled with that name because it kind of suggests something like a landscape and maintenance association, and that's not what it is at all. Think of it as more of a utility district that has bonding capacity, that can go out and bond and raise money in financial markets and bond for and raise upfront significant capital monies in order to build these these systems. And if you think of it as a utility district a little bit rather than an association, a utility district with bonding capacity, then I think it becomes a little bit easier to understand the idea.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, April. Let's go to Jim. You have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Scott, thanks for the presentation. I mean, there's a lot of great work that's gone into this. This has been presented at our development committee, and there's been a lot of effort put into it with the developers on that committee to get their perspective, as well as Steve and Scott and Aaron. And I think this gives us a great guide going forward. There are some elements of it, obviously, that I have concerns myself. I don't particularly like ESCOs, and I think there's a lot of risk in electrification. So I think as we move forward, however, I'm not opposed to this at all, because I think you have a great framework here to make decisions, and that's kind of what this is all about, right? As we move forward, we'll throw out the expectations to the developers and then have that input and dialogue. And at the end of the day, we'll find out what makes the best sense for this project and for the state, right?
Yeah, thank you, Jim.
So I just appreciate all the work that's gone into it. There's been a ton of work put into this, and it's a great process that you've gone through, and we'll get great value out of this. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Scott, did that conclude your presentation?
It does.
Okay. Well, I don't have any other questions coming from the board members. So I just want to echo what Jim said, and before we move on to the next item, that Scott and Steve, great work. I think, as I mentioned, I think we can sense the level of and the depth of this undertaking. It's significant, but it's important because it captures what was important in the legislation, that we would move forward with a project that incorporated those kind of cutting edge technologies that you've introduced here, not just today, but previously. So thank you very much for your work, both of you. And I have a feeling we'll be hearing more about this as we move forward, especially as you've been working with potential developers. So thanks again. So with that, we're going to move on to the next item. Speaking of developers and development partners, the next item of our agenda is to discuss that process. One of the most important decisions that we will undertake as a board is going to be selecting the development partners who will implement our vision. In December, we issued a nationwide RFP that outlined a 2-page process administered by the Division of Facilities Construction Management to select our phase 1 partners. Stage 1 involves reviewing all applications and determining which firms will proceed to stage 2. The stage 2 finalists will work with the land authority over the next few months to explore ideas and develop final proposals. We sent the RFP to dozens of major firms around the country and advertised the process in national and local publications. There was an incredibly enthusiastic response from several top local and national firms that reflects the broad interest nationally and locally in our project. We created a selection committee that has reviewed the applications and interviewed higher scoring applicants. The board will now consider which of the outstanding applicants may proceed to stage 2 of the selection process. In order to undertake that process, it's going to become necessary that we move into closed session for the sole purpose of discussing the qualifications of the applicants. Thereafter, we'll return back to open session to take up any formal action that the board deems appropriate. So accordingly, I would entertain a motion that we go into closed session so we can conduct that review. Jim, Russell making that motion. Do I have a second? April seconding that motion. Motion is that we move into closed session for the purposes that I've indicated previously. All in favor of that motion, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. Motion carries unanimously. So Alan, would you mind kind of instructing everyone how we're going to do that, both virtually and in person here? Let me get your mic on. There you go.
There we go. Thank you. Yes, those of us in person will go to the room next door, 215, and have that conversation. Those of you participating virtually, CC sent out the link and a calendar invitation to you. So you should be able to go to your calendar and link to that executive session from there. If you have any trouble, let us know and we'll try to get you in. But at this point, we'll move into that session.
Thank you. Thank you, Ellen. We'll reconnect in closed session virtually or in person. Thanks.
call
Okay. We are back in open meeting. I'll indicate for the record that the law allows the commission, or excuse me, yes, the commission, when we were in closed session, take a motion to move back into open session, public session, and that motion carried. So we are back here for entertaining potential action. Before we do that, for those for members of the board, we, in visiting with Alan, and I agree as chair, we're going to not cover the last item on the agenda, which is a legislative update. And our director, Alan, has agreed that he will send out a summary of that action. And you're welcome to follow up with Alan or JC Skinner if you have any questions. JC was involved in that process as well. So with that, I'm going to turn time to our director to give a very brief summary for the members of the public as to the work of this review committee. And then he will tell you what the results were or the recommendations of that review committee, and then we will consider action at that time. So let me get your mic on. There you go, Alan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have been really heartened by the level of enthusiasm from the development community about this project and willingness to engage in seeking an opportunity to be partners in this project. After really reaching out nationally through publications and direct contact, we had 9 remarkably experienced and effective development firms and teams that came forward seeking to be the development partner on phase 1. We have a selection committee that was created by the board that reviewed the applications, that interviewed a number of the candidates, and in what was a very difficult decision, had made a recommendation that 3 of the teams move on to stage 2 of our selection process. Those teams were number 1, the Boyer Gardner Center Cal team, number 2, the Catellus Dakota Pacific team, and number 3, the Lincoln Colmena Wadsworth team. So we presented those recommendations to the board for discussion.
Thank you, Alan. And any questions from the board members about that summary? I think we understand that. Jim, question or comment on
I'm
that
just
process?
ready to make a motion when you're ready.
Before you do that, I'm going to ask the director did you indicate who the finalists were as that process? You did. Okay, then we're prepared to entertain a motion. Jim Russell.
All right, I would move that we invite the 3 following firms to stage 2, Boyer Gardner Center Cal as one firm, Catellus and Dakota Pacific as the second firm, and Lincoln Colmena Wadsworth as the third firm.
Thank you, Jim. Would you like to speak to that? Before you do that, do we have a second to that motion?
Second by Mayor Walker.
Second by Mayor Walker. And now back to you, Jim. Would you like to speak to the motion?
Sure. I think this was a really great process that we went through. All 9 of these development teams were very qualified. It was a very difficult decision, but we feel like the 3 firms that were selected through the narrative and through the interviews were the 3 most prepared and responsive to move forward. They all 3 have a little bit different approach to the project, which I think is healthy as well, and we're excited to recommend them to move forward.
Thank you, Jim. The motion is that the 3 firms mentioned move to the next phase of review. I won't restate those firms. I think you have those in mind. Any further discussion on the motion? All right, I'll place that motion for a vote. All in favor of the motion of moving those 3 named firms to the phase 2 review, say aye.
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 Any opposed, say nay. Motion carries unanimously. So let me just say briefly with respect to the next item on the agenda, we're not going to take that item up, as I mentioned, but I would like to say, give credit to our legislators who are members of this board, Senator Stevenson, Senator Fillmore, Representative Handy, who worked well and was supportive of the legislation specifically that related to our work and the work of this board. I want them to be recognized. I also want to recognize J.C. Skinner, who especially the last couple of weeks was very involved in moving the legislation forward that that affected directly our work. That would be HB 438. And you'll hear more about all of those changes that came about that's going to assist us in our work when Alan gets that summary out. But I wanted to recognize those individuals. So with that, I would entertain a final motion. Wait, just before I do that, anything we're missing? Okay, now we'll entertain a final motion. Someone excuse me, Jim.
I move that we adjourn.
Move motion to adjourn, non-debatable. Do I have a second of that? April, would you second that? It's been moved and seconded that we adjourn. All in favor of that motion, say aye.
Aye.
It's unanimous. We stand adjourned. Thank you all for your help today. We got some good work.